I feel like the background.
All right. Hey, we're live. So good morning, everybody. This is a roadshow edition of Ask the Agronomist this morning, joined by my smarter, better, and better-looking colleague, Chris Carlisle, here today, helping us out on Ask the Agronomist. We're live from the world-famous Hagel in Mount Sterling, Illinois. And going to be a meeting going on here after we do our Ask the Agronomist broadcast. And then I'm going to get on the road and go do a field day in Peoria County today. Pretty excited. It'll be my first grower field day in a year plus, probably. And sounds like we're going to have a good crowd there. So as always, my email address is up there on the board. If you can read it, feel free to drop an email with suggestions, questions, things. Remember to log in live on YouTube with your Gmail or YouTube account. You can chat in a question live, and Adam and Jennifer are here as well to man the chat, and we'll get those questions covered. We got lots of things we can talk about today based on the questions that Chris and I have been getting in the field the past couple of weeks. I think we can talk about probably some nutrient issues, some water issues, talk about fungicide. I'd like to give a hail update on the hail-affected acres in my geography. I think there's been other hailstorms around the state as well. Chris's area probably caught some also. So lots of things we can cover today, and we'll certainly put your questions first and foremost on the list. And I guess we'll kind of open things up. And Adam, you got any questions coming in, or what's on your mind this morning?
No questions yet, Lance. Early in the morning, getting started here, though. Obviously, let's talk about recent events with the hail in particular up north. That's what I'd say we need to start with. A lot of rough crops.
Yep. Yeah, you and I were talking about that this morning. I have to admit, I've been a little bit saddened by the lack of recovery that some of these crops have experienced, and the damage was severe enough that it's been hard for those crops to recover. There will be a fair amount of replanting that occurs in the worst of the hail affected areas when and if we get an opportunity to get back in the field. I've kind of lost track of how much rain we've had since that hailstorm, that's coming up on 2 weeks ago tomorrow when we had the severe hail event. And there are soybean fields that from the road, you really still don't see much new growth out there. In plots and demonstrations, I have seen weeds tore up with weed eaters. I have seen beans tore up with weed eaters. I've seen beans tore up with weed whackers. Bob Nielsen has taken baseball bats to crops and just tried to simulate a severe hailstorm. And I haven't ever seen any demonstration of mechanically induced damage trying to simulate bad hail that killed as many plants as this real hailstorm did. Just a tremendous amount of stem damage on those plants, and not just the defoliation that you're used to with a hailstorm. In addition to the defoliation, we damaged the stem, we killed the growing points. A soybean plant is kind of like a tree. The important part of the stems, like on a tree, the layer underneath the bark around the outside of the tree, that's where the nutrients are moving through the phloem up and down in that soybean plant. And when you just riddle that stem, shred that stem to the extent that we did, those plants just have really, really, really struggled to recover. And I really thought we'd have a lot more new growth on some of these plants than we do by now. The wetter parts of the field, the plants literally died. So anywhere where we had an additional moisture stress, the excess moisture we've experienced has been a stress even to the healthy crops. And when you added that stress to the hailstorm, those plants just could not withstand that. So there'll be some replanting. A few guys even talking about replanting corn in July rather than live with what they've got. Kind of depends on your insurance situation there, what you're going to do. If you're going to chop, most of these guys that are talking about replanting corn, planning on chopping it for silage. That would be a lot safer bet than grain harvest with a July planted corn crop. But pretty severe area hail in primarily southern Knox County is where the worst of that is, and that's an area, if you haven't traveled through there, west of London Mills, north and east of a little town of Herman, north of Highway 116 primarily. Then there are a couple areas, a couple other small pockets as well, but several square miles would be the way I described it. Corn, severe amounts of green snap stand loss, a lot of damage. We've seen some plants with growing points damaged from just the physical pounding of the hailstones, and corn plants not recovering because the growing point was damaged. So a lot of stuff that ended up being a lot worse than what your defoliation chart in a Purdue guide or in that your hail adjuster is going to use ended up being a lot more severe than what those charts would indicate. So kind of a sad thing to drive around through that part of the state right now and look at all the wind damage, trees tipped over, sheds gone, soybean fields that are brown the 1st of July. It's just not a fun place to spend time, and pretty tough area to be farming in this growing season.
Yeah, definitely feel sorry for those guys that had that happen. A lot of recovery, and recovery not really an option in some cases, unfortunately. But
yep.
That's so Lance is in charge of the northern half, or oversees the northern half of the West Central Valley team. Chris has kind of the southern half of our team. Chris, what are you seeing down there? I know there's been a lot of moisture, excessive moisture in some areas, which brings up questions of recovery, capability to recover with excess moisture. And then the next obvious question, probably with both of you to talk about a little bit, is what are we thinking for nitrogen loss and nutrient availability going forward in the season?
Right. Great question, Adam. So good morning, everyone. Happy to be here and join Lance on his Ask the Agronomist session. So as Adam said, so I cover more of the southern tier of the team. So my footprint generally is Quincy to Decatur along the I-72 corridor, if you will. It's kind of the footprint that I run. And lucky for me in my territory, yes, we had some hail, but nothing near like what Lance had in some of his worst parts. Most of the bad hail in my territory would have been southern Sangamon County, kind of on the southwestern corner of that, close to Morgan County. So that area would have been my worst. But for the most part, I don't have anything that anybody's going to replant at this point. 40 to 50%, maybe some 60% defoliation might have been the types of levels that we were seeing within my footprint. So most of that is recovering quite nicely, more like what we would typically expect. So feel relatively fortunate versus what Lance has experienced in his territory. As far as rainfall, obviously, we've gotten plenty. We've kind of gone from feast to famine, or famine to feast here recently with rain, not right, because the first 15, 18 days of the month we were dry. We had a lot of corn rolling, below average rainfall. And then we really haven't been able to turn the tap off since. I was a little bit surprised. I saw this bright sunny thing, or bright shiny thing in the sky this morning on the drive in, and kind of forgotten what that thing looked like. So
all that heat and humidity will kick off some sort of showers by this afternoon, I'm sure.
Right, exactly. So
funny you talk about the sun. Just to add to it real quick, I think it was you that was telling me you had friends that had the solar panel system.
Yep, yeah, I figured I would hit on that.
That are actually exhibiting measurable less sunshine, or less production of solar energy.
Yeah. I'll weave that in here as we share a few more details about that. But so like most people, like everywhere, we've gotten plenty of rain. We don't need any more at this point. We've gotten. Some areas have gotten a third to a half of what the corn crop needs in the last week, and close to a quarter of the average yearly rainfall in the last week. So let's hope that means that we don't balance out the rest of the year, as it would be the hope at this point, that we don't turn back into a dry pattern after this. Several places had 4 to 5, 6 inches of rain there at Father's Day weekend when some of those hailstorms moved through, and then on top of that, they've gotten another that plus. In my area, again, it's spotty. My house where I live, I haven't had quite that much. I'm a little bit more thankful. To Adam's point, is something I noticed in my yard the other day, and I've noticed it in considerable other places as I drive around. I've got a lot of mushrooms popping in my yard. Yeah. And I'm sure some of you have seen that in your yards as well. So I would say that's we can get more into fungicides here in a little bit, but that's obviously very indicative that we've got a environment that's good for fungal growth. And so that's something to be thinking about. We can weave that into a fungicide conversation. To Adam's point, I had the opportunity to be with some guys a couple days ago that have solar panels, and on their phone they have an app that Basically, they can measure the amount of sunlight that they're getting and the amount of energy that they're producing off of the solar panels. And so if they looked at that, they were showing me their monthly charts on those solar panels and the output of the solar panels. And so for March and April, they were above target of what the energy company thought they would produce for that time period, giving typical average sunshine. But for May and June, they were drastically beneath that. And so as I think about that, I think about at the end of the day, right, we're harvesting a crop that's driven by the sunlight, by a process of sunlight, right, and photosynthesis. And while we're on track on GDUs and maybe a little ahead of pace on GDU accumulation, we've lacked sunshine, and with all the cloud cover we've had. And so that does weigh on my mind a little bit as we think about yield predictions and what the outcome of the year may be, and that we haven't had the photosynthetic capacity that we would like to have at this point in the growing season.
It would be pretty rare that solar radiation would end up being a yield limiting factor, because normally temperature, moisture, something else is what ends up limiting our yield. And so we sometimes worry about sunlight. But if you're in a situation where nothing else is limiting, and Chris is right, we have had just a tremendous number of cloudy days, and this should be our peak sunlight part of the year. And we just went through the summer solstice, and these are the longest days of the year, and this should be the best growing environment we have in the year. And cloudy weather, solar radiation's down, wet saturated soils, that stuff's really having a hard time surviving through. So we are stressing this crop, and I've commented to several people that for all the people in the country that are still begging for rain, and I sure wish we could share some of our extra with them, because I think our wetness has hurt us far more than any dry period we had, and you guys being dry early is helping you now, because you had more room to go with some of that excess moisture. Right. If you travel to parts of the state that have had that much or more rain and were not dry early, that crop is really, really, really struggling. And you've got ponds and yellow spots and stunted areas in every field. And I think we're going to get lots of questions about supplemental nitrogen and what should we throw in with a fungicide. I know there's a few guys that are flying on some urea and doing things like that now. I'm doing a little experiment on my farm at home where we're going to fly on 40 units of nitrogen and 5 units of sulfur at a cost of about $45 an acre with the application. So that's the problem with supplemental fertility. Nobody had that stuff prepaid, and everything, if you can find it, is expensive. And the product that I could find was a urea-based product that had some sulfur in it. I like the analysis. It's a 40005, and I'm going to do some 100 pounds of that and just see what we see. I think the crop would definitely appreciate being given some more nutrients, either foliarly or through the soil. The trick is it going to give you a positive ROI? And that to me is what's harder to answer. I know the crop is stressed. I got a call from a guy last night that wants to do something with his fungicide to help alleviate nutrient stress. And his thought process is, if the plant can't get it through the soil, am I better off to give it a little pick me up foliarly? The logic I follow. I wish I was a little more confident in your ability to get a positive ROI on that. I know somebody Chris and I both know well that's a smart guy that's been far more successful than either of us. Always used to say you never want to give up on a crop, and I believe that. I also think if you take that to an extreme, you get to the throwing good money after bad stage. And I think in some cases that might be where we're at. But I do think we'll get lots of questions about, should I try this? Should I try that? Is this worth doing? Is that worth doing? And those are going to be hard questions to answer in a black and white way.
So Lance hit on that a little bit. Expand on that in regards to if we throw extra nitrogen at the crop, or we're throwing, a fungicide or other things in regard to the plant's ability to actually utilize what we're putting at it, given current conditions we've got.
Right. So a additional nutrient, or a biological or some sort of PGR type product, it is really going to do nothing to fix the problem that the crop has today. The problem that the crop has today is it's setting in water. Basically, it's setting in a saturated soil. Those conditions need to improve for that crop to be able to access nutrients that are in the soil. We've undoubtedly lost some nitrogen in these wet soils, but there's going to be more nitrogen mineralized, and it's going to be difficult for these plants to take advantage of anything until the soil conditions improve. Now, once soil conditions have improved, would that plant benefit from having some more readily available nutrient? Perhaps. Hard to say definitively. And there's a million different products out there that you can use, and I wouldn't discourage anybody from trying anything. There is no particular program that I'm going to recommend broadly across lots of acres other than fungicide. And if you want to throw something in with your fungicide while you're there, I wouldn't say that this is a bad year to maybe try something like that. We got fairly high commodity prices. We got a crop that's been stressed. We got a crop that would probably appreciate a little bit higher quality of life. And if you feel you've got a product that could do that economically, it might be worth a shot.
I agree with you, Lance and Chris. I think you got to take inventory of your own farming situation. We've all had enough water. Some people have had excessive amounts of water on their particular farms or fields, and some people have had just a really healthy amount of water and not so excessive. So I think people need to take into consideration how much opportunity they have with their particular farming operation in their fields. Yeah. And I would absolutely encourage everybody to try doing some of those things to push the yield as much as they can, because let's face it, commodity prices are great, and some of those crops still have, particularly in Chris's footprint, there's a lot of areas that really haven't had as many ponding issues. Plenty of water, but and in some places excessive, but I think there's a lot of opportunity. So we got a question that came in from Jordan Zimmer that we were going to get to here. It's a great question, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan.
He's wanting to know if we can speak on fungicide and insecticide timing to corn and beans.
Sure.
And if this is the
you want us to argue about it or speak on it? Yeah, that's why you never want to have two agronomists, because it's impossible for two agronomists to agree.
Dangerous game we're playing today. But he's wanting to know, is it the first and only pass of fungicide and insecticide? Or maybe I think he's getting at, could there be a second pass of fungicide and insecticide?
Yeah, I mean, there can be as many passes as you want there to be, Jordan. So, I think there's been a lot of people talking about, especially in these, some of these stressed and damaged crops, the potential for a fungicide application to help the recovery and help the healing. So I do think there was some fungicide that went out a little bit early. My fear of that was I don't want to move the properly timed application earlier and then not do the proper timed application. So, are you willing to do multiple applications? A lot of guys are working with fungicide on V5, V6 corn with herbicide in some cases, in addition to a tassel time application. My favorite time to apply fungicide on a corn crop, if you're only going to do it once, is, somewhere between tassel and mid-green silk, basically. Some people will push that a little later. There are some products that are promoting going earlier than that. I still think that is the sweet spot. The bulk of the data would say that is your best odds of a positive response and your best odds of a bigger response if you're in that, right close to pollination time frame. In corn, soybeans, R3 is kind of the sweet spot, somewhere in a range between R2 and R4. And, there are people that have done earlier applications in soybeans. There are people who have done later applications in soybeans. There are people that have tried multiple applications in soybeans, and there's, lots of different times and ways you can use fungicides in soybeans. If you're going after white mold, you need to be earlier. But if you're spraying at R1 for white mold, that doesn't necessarily replace your R3 fungicide application in soybeans. So if you're going after white mold, typically you're looking at 2 applications of fungicide. So, I'll let Chris give his thoughts to go along with that.
Yeah. So just like most things, right? There's a bell curve that in regards to its response. And so Lance hit on them. I mean, most of the time, most of the data would suggest that on beans, that R2, late R2, R3 is kind of the peak of the bell curve on beans, and on corn, generally guys start in T, somewhere in that R1 stage is where we started on corn. But the reality of it is, I mean, you can hit a lot of different stages of growth, and you've got a pretty good window there where you can get a nice, peak positive response towards the top of that bell curve. And so it's not perfect. They will change a little bit by, environment after the application. Some guys need to start a little bit earlier from a logistics perspective on the front half of that bell curve, just to get the workload done and spread it all out and try to catch all of it, because to catch all of it at the absolute peak at the top is a little bit hard to do. But I would agree with him. And I think there's, it certainly feels to me like there's probably an appetite a little bit more this year for guys to try some additional applications. Whether that's pushing the first application a little bit earlier than what we normally would have done, knowing that we're going to come back with a second application. What this bell curve suggests, right, is you can still get positive responses, well early or well late. They're just not going to be as frequent or as big, right? And so that's whether you want to talk about planting populations or nitrogen rates or whatever, almost everything comes back to a bell curve. And so there is several different options out there. One of the things that I have just recently got into some conversations with some people about was maybe a later application of an insecticide on soybeans. And I think the thought process there is that if you think about, maybe I've got a lot of guys in my footprint that are, as soon as we can get across the field, we're going to start putting fungicide, insecticide applications on soybean fields. And, if you think about a lot of the insecticides that are going to go in the tank with those, they've got residuals of maybe 2 to 3 weeks time period. And so we still have a fair amount of time during our 4 time, our 5 time period where we could have pod feeders like stink bugs and whatnot, where they're going to actually impact yield. And so there are some discussions that I've had with some folks of messing with maybe a insecticide only later application to try to address those pod feeders. So, again, there's no perfect way to do it all. All of them kind of differ a little bit, but bear in mind there's a pretty good window at the top of that bell curve that we can capitalize on the products and use them and still get positive responses out of them. And that's why that's partly why you hear people, whether it's logistics, whether it's data, whether it's personal opinion. I've been one sometimes that if there's not a lot of disease at the time of pollination, I may push a guy to wait a little bit so that I extend that residual further into the crop and into that grain fill period. So that's why sometimes the answers will vary.
And that's the last comment Chris made. That's I would say a little bit of a debatable topic, whether you're better off to wait if you don't have disease to try to extend that residual control, because Chris said a couple weeks. Fungicides, regardless of when you spray them, don't have a very long residual. You're going to get what appears to be season-long disease protection in some cases because you broke the disease cycle and you prevented infection at the time of year that infection happens, and then by the time your residual's gone, the environment has changed and the disease doesn't infect it at that point. So, we never get 3 months residual out of a fungicide, regardless of which one you use and when you apply it. If it looks like you got season-long disease control, it's because we stopped the disease cycle, and by the time it gets started back up again, the environment's changed to where it's not really conducive for infection. And the challenge I have with delaying is delaying might be the right thing to do for disease control, but with the plant health benefits that come from the strobies, that benefit is generally biggest when that fungicide is in that plant system right during and after pollination. And if you wait to brown silk to put your fungicide on because you've got low disease pressure, you've kind of missed the sweet spot of the window for the plant health, benefit piece. So, it kind of depends on, are you more focused on disease control? Are you more focused on plant health? All of these products can do both these days with the mixture of strobies and triazoles and other active ingredients that are in them. And yeah, you could debate this for hours. Should you spray now? Should you spray then? Should you spray twice? Should you do a half rate early, full rate later? I mean, all that stuff happens, and then you can dig into the data of what you see, and that makes it even worse because there's so much variability in response. And you can see a 30 bushel response to this program one time, and the next plot you look at, we did the same thing, 3 bushel. And which one of those two is real? Both of them are. And that's Chris and I used to do a lot of response trials of fungicides, and after beating our head against the wall for 2 or 3 years trying to make sense of the data, it's like, I'm just not sure this is a good use of time, because there is a tremendous amount of variability. And to Chris's point, that window is, it's not, it's not a sharp peak. It's that broad bell curve. And if you think about it, every time you spray a field, the whole field's not at the same stage of growth, especially when we used to spray plots. I mean,
so I was just getting ready to say this bell curve would almost kind of be indicative of the curve of the tassel timing of a given plot. So if you make an application at a certain period, you can artificially make one hybrid look better because you caught it more at a proper time. And make other hybrids on the tails of the maturity look off in the data. So that's why it's a little bit hard to do it with a plot, to make a general application across all the hybrids in that trial if you've got a wide range of maturities out there. I mean, honestly, the best way to do it would be to make multiple applications at the proper timing of each individual hybrid, and that's a workload that's really tough to manage.
Yeah, if you truly want to do a response trial, you need to spray every hybrid at the same stage of growth. But if you make applications on different days and the environment's different when you make the application, you can't do it right. It's impossible.
I think there's one thing that we can get both agronomists agreeing on, is that fungicide at all versus no fungicide is, a good idea this year to at least try if you're not practicing those things already. And, great conversation about the timing, guys. A lot of good points made there. We got a lot of opportunity to try different things and a lot of opportunity to get our fungicides on for corn and beans both this year. We could get deeper into that still, I know, but
I can hear people screaming no.
Let's change which bell curve we're looking at and ask more about, does the bell curve get taller or shorter in regards to underdog 3 or underdog 11's question, which is more or less wanting to know.
I was afraid that was a product question. I'm not familiar with that product. You have to give that one.
So, underdog 11 wants to know, do I use fungicide that I originally planned to put on my corn acres? Do I go ahead and put that on my corn acres? Or should I switch that to some corn after soybean acres and I'll let you take this, Lance, since it's in your area, and southeast Knox County had some hail damage. Corn after beans had some hail damage and he says estimates 7 to 8% foliation.
Okay.
So it's kind of on the edge of the destructive area. He wants to know whether he should focus on the corn acres of the fungicide that he originally prepaid for, I'm guessing, versus should he switch over to corn after beans?
I mean, there's a lot of layers to that onion there. I guess the first kind of little bit of a facetious question I would ask would be why we weren't planning on doing, the rotated acres to begin with. So when Chris and I were doing response trials, we would track the response corn on corn versus rotated acres. And it was surprising how often rotated acres responded just as much or more than corn on corn. Sometimes I think because those are higher yielding acres, I think it's easier to get a response in high yield environments. And your rotated acres tend to be your highest yielding environment. So, would it be a good idea to still spray the corn on corn? Absolutely. Would it be a good idea to also spray the rotated ground, assuming you can find some more product to do that? I think so. The caveat I would give on some of these ravaged fields is if you've lost a lot of stand from green snap or what I'm calling hail induced green snap, our green snap wasn't true green snap. The plant was flat to the ground because it had been blown over with 4 inches of rain, 110 mile an hour wind. And then it got pounded with golf ball size hail. And when those hailstones struck it, it literally broke it. And so if you've lost, my number is more than a third of your plants, I really struggle with putting a fungicide on that field because the remaining plants are going to have to increase yield a lot to offset the ones that are missing. Would the plants that are there appreciate a fungicide and benefit from it? Absolutely. Can you get enough of a yield increase when you've lost a lot of stand is the question I have. But the way he described it sounds like primarily just some leaf damage. And if you've still got all your plants, I think that would be a good field to target with a fungicide. To the point Chris already made, I mean, any fungal disease that likes high moisture, high humidity, and cool weather, which that's northern primarily is the first thing that comes to my mind. And I haven't seen a northern lesion yet, but my guess is they're growing out there. They just haven't gotten big enough to see yet. Gray leaf spot likes it a little hotter, but we'll get hot at some point, I'm sure. Physoderma, this is probably the best physoderma weather you could have. So a lot of these fungal diseases, based on the weather we've had, they ought to get bad at some point. So I would probably think it would be a good investment to find some more product if you can and spray both of those acres rather than shift from one acre to another.
I've joked with people, I think that gets into the defensive versus offensive conversation of what are we using the fungicide for. And I've had kind of fun in that conversation with the data that Lance referenced. I think a lot of times we've decided to put the airplane over the wrong fields in the past because we were thinking about protecting the crop from things. And oftentimes that 80-acre field that looks clean as a pin, that's got the rotated, got the ability to make 250 plus. We haven't chosen to put an airplane over top of it because it didn't feel like it needed it. Mm-hmm. But likely that could have been where we got the best ROI out of the application. Right. And so I think sometimes we've faulted by picking the wrong fields. And so I would encourage that. I think I would have us do a little work to figure out where I think my best yield potential is. And obviously we need to take in disease pressure as well to think about, what hybrids we've got out there and their disease tolerances and whatnot. But I would encourage you to, if you got the means to get both of them sprayed, it's actually what I do, but I would put some serious thought into possibly switching that investment to the rotated acre.
That's the other thing that, it became really apparent to Chris and I when we were doing those response trials a few years ago. We didn't consistently see a bigger response at corn on corn sites. We didn't consistently see a bigger response in disease susceptible hybrids. We didn't consistently see a response in full season hybrids. Basically the only thing that was consistent was it was variable. And it got to the point where, I got pretty uncomfortable. My odds of success of predicting to you where you're going to see the 20 bushel yield bump. It's a little bit like taking federal crop or, hail insurance or, any kind of insurance, frankly. If you always knew when you were going to need it, that'd be the year to take it, right? But unfortunately, we don't know when that is. And my fear of trying to pick and choose what years and what fields and what hybrids and what situation to use fungicide or not use fungicide is sometimes you're going to miss that 25 bushel response that would have paid for 3 years of no response. And so that's why over time I've kind of become, hey, I'm going to invest in that on every field that I think has potential to justify investing money in, and quit trying to pick and choose which fields it's going to pay more in, because I don't have a high degree of confidence that we can do that.
Right. Well, you always got to remember too, of course, there's more than just yield that comes along with the fungicide. Right. There's standability, harvestability, all those good things that come along with it as well. And who knows the weather patterns that we're seeing these days, what kind of a fall we're going to have.
Right.
A breeze through, everything's dry, let's get everything harvested, timely fall, or whether we're going to have one of those nasty ones where we leave things to stand and do the best they can at staying upright for
Right. So. Yeah, it's been one of the questions I've gotten frequently on this bad hail damaged corn. You got a lot of abrasions and pock marks and wounds and craters on the stalk, and it kind of makes sense to people that stalk quality is not going to be very good on that stuff, and so maybe I need fungicide on that more. You might, but at the same time, a fungicide, there's limitations to what it can do. If you got a hole in your stalk, you can stick your thumb in. Fungicide ain't gonna fix that. So I guess just be realistic of what you're trying to accomplish with it and what it can and can't do.
Absolutely, yeah. Again, you guys go ahead and if you got any more questions, you can tweet them in, you can text your rep, you can text or type it in on YouTube here. So we got a lot of different ways to answer questions.
We do have a crowd here.
Yeah, so we got a live audience
Yeah,
to join us here. So
today too, so feel free, you guys have any questions, go ahead and speak up, don't be shy and bashful. But I guess the next thing I'd like to talk about is, what are we expecting next out of our crop? Out of our corn crop, out of our bean crop? Where are we at now as far as stage? I know we got a lot of variability due to more replant in some areas, less replant in other areas. But what's, for the majority of the crop, the major thing that we got coming up, of course, is pollination. So what do we need to be thinking about as far as pollination? What's the window of when do we need to be out there looking at how well we pollinated and trying to start making yield estimates and thinking about harvest? Because it'll be right around the corner before you know it.
yeah, let my guys finish planting first.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate situation for you guys out there. I know that they're in a bad situation, but there's a lot of crop out there that's really shooting tassels hard. So
Chris shot me a note earlier this week talking about how short some of his corn's tasseling, and he'll address why that is. But my first surprise was he even had any tassels. And he mentioned that you guys are probably at or maybe even a little ahead on heat units. Well, we're quite a bit behind on heat units actually. The temperature gradient from his territory to mine has been pretty significant. We planted a little bit later. It was cooler. We won't have many tassels for 10 days yet. And I don't think my crop's probably going to be as short as some of his because we weren't as dry or early on and didn't plant as early. But I'll let Chris address the plant height of corn.
Chris, that's a question for you. In our territory, or at least some of my territory, Southern Pike County in particular, my territory, got a lot of stuff planted early April. And man, there's a lot of tassels out there, and let's face it, one of the critical points of growth and development is pollination. And what do we want as far as weather conditions? What do we need to be looking for? I mean, we're going to be out there spraying our fungicides, of course, but what do you think we need to be scouting for during that period of time?
Okay, so I've got quite a few tassels out of it. I got fungicide applications going on already. They started earlier this week on some of the first planted corn. I've got a lot of guys. If the ground was fit, we'd have rates running on beans right now, spraying fungicide applications on beans as well. I think there could be some early aerial applications happening this week on some of those early planted fields that we just can't get the ground rig over. But I would assume that as soon as we dry out, hopefully that's next week. It's what everybody's hoping for. We'll have a lot of ground rigs running for foliar fungicide applications in soybeans. So to this point on corn pollination, obviously it's a critical period. I guess while we've gone through some of the hail, we've had some of the high winds, we've root lodged some corn, we've had dryness, we've had excess rain, we've had a lot of stress that's been thrown at that crop. But really, we're now looking forward is really the most critical point in both crops' life cycle. We can endure some decent stress pre-pollination. We can endure some pre-pollinate, or we can endure some decent stress prior to R2, R3 in beans. It's really the next 45, 60 days that makes us or breaks us.
Right. The stresses we've endured to this point have been subtracting from a theoretical yield that we were never going to see anyway. And so, when you start subtracting from 600, you can do quite a bit of subtracting and still end up with something you're happy with. So I do think, especially this crop that looks as good as, if your acres look good, I think they can still be really good. And to Chris's point, the next 30 days really is going to determine how good the corn crop is. And the next 45 to 60 days are going to determine how good the soybean crop is. If you're in an area that hasn't been flooded out, and you're not looking at beans that have lost, 5 shades of color in the last week, and you're not looking at corn that, I looked at a field the other day that literally the corn that's growing in water is not yet knee high. It's a little remarkable that it's not dead. I mean, it got up and got started, and it has not been submerged long enough to ever kill it, but it hasn't grown in a month. And the corn around that is 6 feet tall and green. Just to see the difference is striking. So, those spots are going to yield next to nothing. Obviously, if you've got a lot of acres of that, that's going to pull back the potential of that field. But I think there's a lot of acres that could still be really, really good. I'm more worried about soybeans than I am corn with this wetness that we've had, and soybeans don't like wet feet ever. And, we've lost a lot of nodules on a lot of these beans. I've got some areas, I don't think they'll have a nodule on them the rest of the year. So that bean's going to live off of whatever it can find in the soil, because its opportunity to fix nitrogen for itself is done for. So those spots are going to be pretty challenged the rest of the year. If you lose your nodules, you're not going to renodulate in July. That ship has sailed. So if you lose the nodules you've got on that plant, I wouldn't expect it to set new ones to help it through the rest of the summer. And so I think a lot of these yellow beans that are setting in soggy soils, we've got poor nodule health, and that's going to impact that plant, unfortunately, for the rest of the year. But I think there's a lot of acres out there that could still be really good, and we certainly need to watch for pollination, and that's one of those things that you want it to be bright and sunny, you want it to be moist, you want it to be moderate temperature. That's ideal conditions for pollination. You don't want it to be 82 at 10:15 at night when you're watching the news. You don't want to wake up to 72 the next morning. If you got cool nights, sunny days, high 80s during the day, plenty of moisture, plenty of sunshine, that's what you want. May not be what we get, and you can't control any of that. So we'll take what we get, but that's what we're hoping for.
And to extrapolate on that a little bit, generally speaking, from a corn pollination perspective, the odds are in our favor in that the plant will produce thousands and thousands and thousands of pollen grains. And at the end of the day, we need about 600 to 700 of them generally to land on silks to fertilize the year. So generally speaking, there's plenty of pollen, as long as we don't miss the nick, as long as we don't have insect feeding on the silks, or they're not protected by a leaf plant or a leaf or something like that. I'd say somewhat lucky for us, some of the root lodging happened when it did, because it was earlier on. Root lodging at pollination time is really yield impactful, because you end up with a hidden silk or hidden ear underneath leaves, and we don't get good pollination. So some of the early root lodging was not, it's going to be a little bit of a pain to harvest. So to his point, he kind of hit on, ideally what would we like to see out of pollination timing here on corn, but the odds are in our favor in regards to the number. Sorry, I'm a fidgeter. I had to have one of these in my hand.
That's why I gave you mine, so there was going to be trouble if you didn't have one.
You've been doing probably more fidgeting with it than I have, so we're both kind of on that. But in regards to soybeans, I think one of the things that concerns me a little bit with beans is there's not a lot of beans, even some of these very first planted ones, that have closed the row yet. Which means in my personal opinion, I don't believe the nodes are there. I think our internodes are stacked a little bit, so I think it might be a little bit deceiving. Just like in corn, our overall plant height is a little bit short, so we've got shorter internodes. But at the end of the day, you've got to have nodes to put on flowers and put on pods in soybeans. And my concern with some of the shorter statured beans that we've got, and some of the tough growing conditions we've had on beans, is we don't have a tremendous amount of nodes at this point. Now, obviously, given all the rain we've had here recently, we get some nice, good sunny days. We're going to put on some good vegetative growth. And I think that's part of what was limiting our vegetative growth into this rain was that we were dry for so long. And now we've got ample moisture to generate some vegetative growth. And I would fully expect that we're going to put on some, good 6-8+ inches of vegetative growth here in the coming weeks. Because we've often seen that in previous years, and that kind of goes back to that fungicide timing conversation. I love to point this out that there's been times here in recent years we've moved into R3, which is kind of that perfect time to make a fungicide application of beans. But then we'll catch 1 inch to 2 inches worth of rain and throw on another 6 inches of growth, and we resort back to R2, and in that plant's life cycle. So that does change a little bit, and so I guess I'm excited now that we've got some rain. I think we will see some vegetative growth, and hopefully we'll get some row shaded and rows closed here soon. So we can, that's the best weed control we can get.
Right. That additional vegetative growth we know is coming. That's actually something that I think to think about when you're timing your fungicide, because there isn't a fungicide on the marketplace that's going to protect vegetation that's not there the day you spray. To protect that vegetation, it needs to be coated with that fungicide. Fungicides are not going to move, up in the plant and protect new growth. So, I tend to think that, there's probably not a lot of soybean acres that maybe are ready for fungicide yet. I might step on some toes saying that if guys want to get the work done, but unless you're targeting early R2 in soybeans, I'm not sure Chris's territory has got any soybeans in R3. And to Chris's point, sometimes R3 can seemingly last for a month just because they continue to grow. And so I've had guys in past years that, have been trying to, intentionally do like a late R3, early R4, because they just like to be a little towards the latter end of that. And eventually they get tired of waiting for them to get there and just go do it, because it can, as they continue to grow, that's what indeterminate soybeans do. They continue, and you want them doing that. And to Chris's point, they've got a lot of growth left to go. And we need to get those additional nodes and that, yield potential out there. So
we had a question.
I think we got a question in the room too, so go ahead and get yours, and then we'll.
All right, let's
get
do
one.
this one first. We got about 15 minutes left here. So got a question that came in about soybeans. You were talking about the lack of nodulation there earlier.
Wouldn't be lack of, it would be death of.
Yeah.
They were nodulated well to begin with.
Yeah, so with the death and lack of more nodulation coming, so you're not going to have as much nitrogen production or synthetic production of nitrogen with soybeans. Is that the reason why we're seeing so much yellowing in the soybeans, or is that more due to suffocation? And would a supplemental nitrogen application with the fungicide be a good idea in soybeans?
Yeah, I'm afraid somebody's going to ask that question. There's a lot of layers to that question. So the yellowing in soybeans, absolutely is due to the saturated soil conditions. In those saturated areas of the field, we have definitely damaged the nodules and have poor nodule health. I don't think every yellow soybean has dead nodules, but there certainly are some who do. And if you've ever split a nodule open before with a knife, you're probably going to have a hard time finding a pink one right now. Just because they're not pink doesn't necessarily mean that they won't recover and regain that healthy pink color. But if they're mushy, if they're rotten, if they're brown, if they're dropping off the roots, those are dead. So I think combination of things there. The main issue is the excess moisture, and really any bean that's growing in a wet soil has lost that good green color, and they've kind of reverted back to that kind of ugly pale yellow color that a lot of times they have early in the season before they start fixing nitrogen. The question on supplemental nitrogen, it's really hard to get a feel for that on soybeans. Foliar ain't going to cut it, for nitrogen on soybeans, just because a soybean crop, a good one, needs 400 plus units of nitrogen. And the 8 minutes worth of nitrogen that you can put on a soybean plant, foliarly, probably not going to have a huge response. If you've got soybeans that you think you're going to have to feed nitrogen to because they can't fix their own, you'd literally be talking, a couple 100 pounds of urea to feed a soybean plant. Nobody's going to want to spend that much money on the crop. I wouldn't invest that much money. If you've lost your nodules on a soybean crop, my guess is that soybean crop's going to be pretty mediocre, no matter how much money you spend on it. And that might be getting into that throwing good money after bad category, in my opinion. Would those soybeans appreciate a pick-me-up of micros and some growth promoting products and a little bit of potassium, a little bit of nitrogen in with that fungicide application? I'm sure they'd love it. But you can't get 400 units of N, to a soybean plant. So we have to hope the best scenario for those soybean plants would be moist, soil conditions, ideal soil conditions for mineralization. We release a lot of nitrogen through organic matter mineralization in that soil, and those soybeans are able to access the nitrogen that they need through the soil. But if you want to feed a soybean crop with nitrogen, you're talking pounds, lots of pounds, not what you can deliver foliarly.
Right. In particular, we were talking about stressed soybeans, but what about if they're not stressed?
Yeah.
What about if we've got some healthy growing soybeans that are, symbiosis and nitrogen production nodules are good?
Yep.
What do we think as far as supplemental fertilizer, borons, or nitrogen,
Right.
so on and so forth?
Right. I would tend to say that those products are hard to predict when you're going to see a response, kind of like that fungicide conversation we were having. You don't always see a response. Sometimes you see something pretty exciting. A lot of times you see something that, no big deal. To me, all these plants are probably short on nutrients just because of the environment we've been in. If you feel like you've got really good yield potential still with the opportunity we have from a commodity price standpoint, I would agree this would make sense to be a year to try some stuff and maybe be a little more aggressive with some of those programs. I always encourage people to try things. I don't ever like doing a whole field. Sometimes guys don't really want to try something because if you try it, then you know whether you did the right thing or not. And sometimes we don't want to know whether we, water our money away.
It goes both ways, right?
With field view and yield monitors and the ability to map fields, it's never been easier to compare stuff. And that nitrogen trial I'm doing on corn, I'm taking about 5 or 6 bigger fields, and I'm going to spray 20% of the field diagonally across the rows. Every pass through every one of those fields I do, I'm going to go in and out of that strip with yield monitor. So I'm going to know what I got for my $45.
You got to know whether you wasted it or whether you should have spent $45.
That's right.
Every acre.
Yep. And one of those two things is going to happen. I'm either going to be thankful I didn't do the whole field, or I'm going to be kicking myself that I didn't do the whole field.
Yeah, I laughed when he made that comment because I had a guy last year told me, he goes, I refuse to split fields to try anything because he said, I'm just going to be mad either way.
Yeah.
I'm either mad I didn't do the whole field or I'm mad I spent the money on the part I did.
Yep.
And I thought that was an interesting way to look at it. That's a challenge. So he looks to other people to provide him suggestions on what he ought to do, and he's going to do it across the whole field. And that's just the way he's going to do it.
I'll tell you a little secret too. If all farmers thought that way, it'd be really tough for Chris and I to learn what we ought to tell people to do. It's hard to get people to make comparisons. So
I think part of the one thing I would interject, and I think this goes back even to the conversation around nitrogen on corn as we go forward, is I think one, you got to figure out what's your CECs, what's your organic matter content, what's your ability of the soil to be able to provide nitrogen to that crop that's there. What was your starting point? Were you maybe a little heavy to start with or a little light?
Yep.
Right. So those are all things that kind of come into play in regards to, would you get a response out of an additional application is what was your starting point and what's your soil supplying power to the crop?
How much rain have you had? Were they big events? Were you dry early on or were you not dry? When did that nitrogen go on? What's the relative maturity of your corn crop? When did you plant it? Population, all that stuff.
We're in peak use time right now, but we're also, once we dry out, we're also in peak mineralization time as well. So we've got a little bit going for us there, that if the soil's got the ability to mineralize it, we keep the right environment, which we're going to have plenty of moisture once we dry out to do mineralization. That those two might work hand in hand, and we might not be as bad off in some cases.
Well, and generally speaking, it's pretty rare that corn will respond significantly to nitrogen applications after tassel. If you need to get nitrogen, if you think you need to get supplemental nitrogen on corn, you probably need to get it done before tassel, in my opinion. And you need to hope that you get some moisture on that soon after you make that application, because I think I'm putting my application on today. My corn's about 10 days, 2 weeks from tassel. When I had the idea to do this last Tuesday, I asked, could it be done by Friday? And they said, hell no. And so at first I thought, well, screw it then. I'm not going to mess with it because I don't want to do it after the rain's over. But I've decided that we're still going to do this because it's research purposes. I'm trying to learn. But I'm nervous that the next chance of rain is about a week out, and if it doesn't rain for 2 or 3 weeks after I make this application, that was a waste of time and money.
post-tassel applications are tough because you've got to have time for nitrogen. You got to have time to get them into the soil, and the soil solution taken up by the plant actually have an impact. And so you've kind of got a closing window there on your opportunity of how that's going to work. We did have a question in the crowd a while ago. So Robert, do you have a question as far as?
So what about the early beans? What about the early beans versus the later planted beans? And knowing what the early beans went through, maybe in your area with the poor nodulation and stuff because of the saturated soils. So if you were looking at a bean planted before Mother Day massacre and after, potential of those two beans setting through water and the poor nodulation, maybe. How do you feel about the later planted beans being as good, maybe, as some of the earlier planted?
So the question is, just to make sure everybody can hear this, basically a question around early planted beans versus later planted beans, with kind of Mother's Day being the split and the concern with the environment that we've sat through.
So basically, is there a chance that because of everything the early planted beans went through, that we don't see maybe the advantage that we typically do for early planting? I'm never going to bet against early planted beans because that data has been so consistent over the years that no matter what yield level you're at, no matter what type of environment you have, they typically have an advantage because while the early planted beans haven't grown as much as normal, the late planted beans have grown even less. And so, I guess I don't see the later planted beans handling these stresses any better than the early planted beans have in my area. So I'm a little concerned about all bean yields, but I'm probably still more optimistic about the early beans than I am the late. But we're not seeing, we just haven't seen. I was looking at some of mine. I've got some April 5th planted 15-inch row beans that haven't closed the row yet. And I'm not real proud of that, but it is what it is. And
the weather pattern going forward could change that one way or the other, given the right rain at the right time. But I think my response to that is, I think it ties back to, I would still be more optimistic the early planted beans because I had a bigger bean that I'm capturing more sunlight with summer solstice, more pod, more nodes, more places to put on pods right now, and I'm just capturing more sunlight that's out there. But it could easily be trumped by weather in August and early September.
Hey guys, I think we're going to wrap it.
Grab one more here.
Sorry, go ahead.
What's the prediction on Japanese beetles pressure? Benefits maybe adding insecticide in corn, pesticide applications, etc.
And I started seeing Jap beetles a week ago. I mean, I haven't seen a population anywhere that would be concerning, but they're definitely there. I think there's probably an argument to be made that we might be missing out on something by not more often including insecticide with fungicide on corn. It's such a standard practice on soybeans because we generally see a little more yield. I sometimes wonder, would we be seeing that in corn too if we were doing it more often, and we're just not. It's hard to control Japanese beetles, so while there may be a benefit to the insecticide, it may not be because you control Japanese beetles. You need to pick your product a little carefully and your rate, and when it gets really hot, they're really, really, really difficult to control. And even if you do control them, new ones will fly in tomorrow, and nothing's really going to give you a great residual on Jap beetles. So I think there's probably times that we, probably ought to be trying to control them, but I don't very often see them interfering with pollination in corn. There's so many things they would rather eat than corn. But we certainly need to keep an eye on that, and there are situations where they do impact pollination. But I haven't seen populations yet that would warrant a concern about that. But they're just getting started too. So.
Great questions, great conversation today, guys. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. We got about 3 minutes till 8:30, so if somebody wants to try and sneak one in, you can go for it, but we may not get it. I'd just like to remind everybody that, if you like these conversations and this type of information that's pertinent to our part of the world, we do it every 2 weeks. The next time will be on the 15th of July. It'll be a Thursday, so tune in. You can get subscribed to our YouTube channel, the Cal Bazar, West Central Illinois. If you hit the subscribe button, and then if you hit the notification bell, it'll pop up on your phone or your mobile device, send you an email perhaps, and let you know that it's going to happen, and give us something to talk about, and give us a opportunity to stump our agronomists here. I always like to try and do that. They like that challenge, I think. So.
Yep. So I guess I would add to that, if you have thoughts on a better day for us to do this broadcast, we've thought about maybe changing it to like an after lunch timing instead of early morning. We realize there's no perfect time for everyone. These videos are recorded and they stay on this YouTube channel indefinitely. We get a lot of people that watch the videos after the fact that they're recorded. We'd love to have more live participation. So if in your opinion there's a better time of day for us to do this that would make it easier for you to participate live, let somebody know what your suggestion for that would be. Appreciate your participation, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.